The protein bar had been in Dara's jacket pocket since breakfast. She kept meaning to finish it. She never did. That small, forgotten detail was the reason the galaxy changed. Dara Voss was not the kind of person history usually picked. She was 28 years old, medium height, with short dark hair and a habit of chewing the end of her stylus when she was thinking hard. Her official title was Atmospheric Calibration Technician, 3rd grade, assigned to the Earth Allied Coalition delegation. Her job was to make sure the air inside the human wing of the Concordat ring smelled like breathable oxygen and not like the recycled coolant that leaked from the ring's older pipes. It was important work. Nobody thought it was important work. The Concordat ring was a space station the size of a small moon, built at the crossing point of 5 major travel lanes. 5 civilizations used it. Nobody owned it. That was the point. It existed so that beings who would otherwise communicate entirely through warships could sit in the same room and talk instead. It was, in theory, a great achievement of interstellar diplomacy. In practice, it smelled like a mixture of every alien atmosphere that had ever been piped through its ventilation system, and the lighting in the lower corridors was always slightly wrong. Too yellow for humans, too blue for the Golsari, too bright for the Thurvak, and somehow still too dim for the dragons. The dragons, that was why this summit mattered in a way that the previous 4 had not. The Draconis Sovereign Collective did not usually attend Concordat summits as participants. They attended as arbiters, ancient, enormous, patient, and largely indifferent to the concerns of younger civilizations. They had been in space longer than humanity had been using written language. They did not have territorial disputes because no one was foolish enough to contest their territory. They arrived at summits the way mountains arrive at the edge of a valley. They were simply there, and everything else arranged itself around them. This summit was different because the Hatchling was coming. Dara had heard about it the same way she heard about most things through the junior staff message channel, which was faster and more accurate than any official briefing. A royal hatchling, the first one in over a century. Dragon royalty was not born often, and when it was, it did not leave home. It certainly did not attend diplomatic functions. The last 3 summits had included a senior dragon elder, 2 silent dragon observers, and 1 very old dragon who had slept through most of the 3rd day. A hatchling was something else entirely. A hatchling was, according to Lyra, a young dragon scholar whose translated texts had been circulating in the junior staff channel, sacred in a way that did not have a clean translation into standard. Something between air, symbol, and living promise. Dara had read the text, nodded, and gone back to checking the East Corridor sensor array. The day the hatchling arrived, Dara was positioned at a calibration panel near the back wall of the main ceremonial hall. She was not supposed to be in the hall at all. Technicians were meant to complete their checks before events began, but Sensor Panel 7 had developed a fault 20 minutes before the arrival ceremony, and her supervisor had made the call to fix it live rather than delay the atmospheric clearance. So Dara was there, crouched behind a decorative pillar, running a bypass sequence on a stubborn oxygen mix reader, when every other being in the hall stood up straighter and went very, very quiet. She noticed the quiet first, then she looked up. The hatchling was smaller than she expected. She had been imagining something the size of the elder dragons she had seen in briefing images, vast, ancient, their scales like the surface of cooled lava. The hatchling was maybe the size of a large horse. Its scales were pale and iridescent, shifting between silver and a faint gold-green depending on how the hall's light touched them. It moved carefully, the way something moves when it has recently learned that its body is larger than it used to be. Its eyes were enormous, deep amber, with a vertical pupil that caught the light and held it. Behind it came Vera, the senior attendant, a dragon considerably larger than the hatchling, her scales the dark gray of deep water, her expression one of total authority. Behind Vera came 2 more attendants, and behind them came Elder Soren, who had to angle his body sideways to enter through the hall's largest doorway, and who made the entire room feel smaller simply by being in it. Every delegation had prepared gifts. The EAC's gift was a framed holographic projection of Earth's night sky, which had seemed meaningful in the planning meeting and now, in this room, looked like something from a gift shop. The Thurvak Dominion had brought a crystallized stellar fragment in a case that probably cost more than Dara's yearly salary. The Golsari Republics had brought a living fire bloom, a plant that burned continuously without consuming itself, which seemed like the kind of thing dragons would appreciate. The gifts were arranged on a long presentation table at the center of the hall. Vera led the hatchling toward it. The hall held its breath. The hatchling sniffed the stellar fragment. It looked away. It sniffed the fire bloom. It looked away. It sniffed the EAC night sky projection. It looked away, then looked back at it briefly as if reconsidering, and then looked away again more firmly. It sniffed every gift on the table. It turned away from every one. Vera's jaw tightened. The silence in the hall was the kind that has weight. Dara could feel it pressing against her ears. Then the hatchling turned from the table entirely. It walked slowly, deliberately, in a perfectly straight line across the full width of the ceremonial hall, past the Thurvak ambassador, past the Golsari envoys, past the EAC's ambassador Hark, who went visibly pale, past Elder Soren, who watched without moving, across the floor, past the decorative pillar, all the way to the back wall where a technician in a worn field jacket was crouched next to a faulty sensor panel. It stopped in front of Dara. Dara looked up. The hatchling looked down. For a moment, neither of them did anything. Then the hatchling's gaze dropped to Dara's jacket pocket, where the end of the protein bar was just visible above the flap. Dara looked at the protein bar. She looked at the hatchling. The hatchling's amber eyes were patient and very direct. "Okay," Dara said quietly, because it seemed like the thing to say. She took the protein bar out of her pocket. She held it out. The hatchling leaned forward and took one careful, deliberate bite. It chewed, it swallowed. It held her gaze for a moment longer. Then it turned and walked back toward Vera with the same calm certainty with which it had crossed the hall. Dara looked down at what was left of the protein bar. Behind her, the hall had stopped breathing entirely. In 30 years of covering interstellar events, the Golsari journalist in the third row would later say she had never once recorded silence that felt like it had teeth. Dara put the rest of the protein bar back in her pocket. She turned back to sensor panel 7. The bypass sequence had completed successfully. She went back to work. Rumors move faster than light on space stations. On the Concordat ring, they moved faster than that. By the time Dara had packed her calibration tools and walked back to the human delegation's wing, 3 separate people had already sent her messages. She had not answered any of them because she had not checked her communicator. She was thinking about the protein bar. Specifically, she was thinking about whether she had another one in her bag because she had not eaten lunch and the ceremonial hall had run 2 hours long and she was hungry. She had just found one peanut-adjacent flavor, which was her second choice, but acceptable, when the door to her room slid open without a knock and Counselor Death walked in. Death was the EAC's senior political advisor. He was the kind of man who wore his authority the way some people wear expensive shoes, constantly aware of it, hoping others were too. He was followed by Ambassador Hark, who looked like he had aged 4 years in the last 40 minutes, and 2 junior staff members who were there to take notes and not speak. "Sit down," Death said. "I'm already sitting," Dara said. She was, in fact, sitting on the edge of her bunk, halfway through unwrapping the protein bar. Death stared at the protein bar as though it had personally offended him. "Put that away." Dara put it in her lap. "What do you need?" What Death needed, it turned out, was an explanation. Specifically, he needed to know what Dara had done. Said applied, sprayed, emitted, or otherwise introduced into the environment near the royal hatchling that had caused it to cross a diplomatic ceremonial hall and eat food from her pocket. He needed this information immediately. He had a list of questions. He had cross-referenced the list against the atmospheric data from the hall, the EAC delegation's equipment manifest, and the full ingredient label of every food item registered on the delegation's nutrition supply list. Dara told him she had done nothing. She had been fixing a sensor. She had been quiet. She had been minding her own work. When the hatchling came and looked at her protein bar, she held it out because it seemed rude not to. Death asked if she understood what the forbidden bite was. Dara said she did not know that term. Death told the two note-takers to stop writing for a moment, then told Dara, in a voice that was very controlled, that what she had just participated in was one of the most significant acts in draconic cultural history, the precise meaning of which was still being urgently translated, but which involved concepts of trust, soul bonding, and lineage that no non-dragon had ever been part of before. Ever. In 8,000 years of draconic recorded civilization. Dara looked at him, she looked at the protein bar in her lap, she looked back at him. "I just held out my food," she said. "Yes," said Death, "and that is what we need to understand." She answered every question. She had nothing to hide and nothing to explain beyond the plain truth. She had been hungry, she had forgotten to finish her breakfast protein bar, the hatchling had looked interested, and she had shared it. She could not explain why the hatchling had chosen her. She could not explain why it had ignored 8 carefully prepared diplomatic gifts worth more than some planetary economies. She had not planned any of it. She was a calibration technician. She calibrated things. Death left looking unsatisfied. Hark paused at the door and gave her a look that she could not quite read, not accusatory, more like a man who had just realized the ground under him was a different shape than he had thought. Dara ate the rest of the protein bar. Then she opened her botany manual, a worn digital collection of earth plant studies she had been reading her way through for the past year, and read about the root systems of mountain fig trees for 40 minutes until she felt calmer. She was midway through a chapter on lateral root growth when someone knocked. Actual knocking, which was unusual. She said, "Come in." The dragon who entered was small by dragon standards, which still meant she was the size of a large wardrobe. Her scales were a pale bronze-gray, and she moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lot of time in spaces built for beings much smaller than herself. This was Lyra, though Dara did not know her name yet. Lyra said she was delivering a diplomatic courtesy tray on behalf of the dragon delegation. The tray had a bowl of warm grain broth and a bread roll, both sourced from the ring's human-compatible food supply. She set it down on the small table and did not leave. Dara said, "Thank you." Lyra said the grain was a variety found in northern Earth climates. She had researched it. She asked if it was acceptable. Dara said it was very thoughtful. There was a pause. Lyra asked what the protein bar was made of. Dara told her, compressed oat flour, dried fruit paste, synthetic vanilla extract, a small iron supplement, stabilizer, and a flavoring compound that was labeled on the packet as blueberry adjacent. Lyra's eyes moved in a way that was clearly the draconic equivalent of someone writing very fast. She asked Dara to repeat the ingredients slowly. Dara did. Lyra asked if the iron supplement was significant. Dara said it was a standard addition for people who did not eat enough red meat and did not want to be tired all the time. Lyra made a sound that the translation unit around her neck rendered as understood, categorizing. Then Lyra asked what a forbidden bite was, not to explain it, but to ask if Dara had heard of it. Dara said she had been told the term, but did not know what it meant. Lyra explained it carefully. When a hatchling hatched, it was given a first meal by its family. That was the acknowledgement, the bond of blood and kin. If a hatchling, during that first ceremonial meal, chose to offer a portion of its food to another being freely, without prompting, without ceremony, that was called the bond offer. In the history of the Draconis Sovereign Collective, bond offers had been made to dragon family members, to dragon attendants, to elder dragons. They were rare and sacred. They had never been made to a non-dragon. What the hatchling had done in the ceremonial hall was the inverse. It had accepted food from Dara rather than offering. There was no recorded word for this. There was no protocol. Vera had been repeating the phrase, "This has no precedent," for the past 2 hours without adding anything else to it. Dara asked if the hatchling would be in trouble. Lyra looked at her for a long moment. "You do not understand," she said. "We do not question what a hatchling chooses. We do not punish it. We spend the next 100 years, if necessary, asking why. A hatchling's instinct is not something we override. It is something we try to understand." She paused, her tail moved, a slow, thoughtful sweep. The question is not whether the hatchling made the right choice. The question is what it understood that we did not. Dara thought about that. It seemed like a reasonable way to think. She said so. Lyra looked at her again with that same focused, categorizing attention. She said that Elder Soren had made a formal request, not to Ambassador Hark, not to Counselor Death, to Dara Voss, third-grade calibration technician, by name. He wanted to speak with her privately. Tomorrow morning, in the Dragon Quarters. Alone. Dara nodded and said she would be there. Then she asked Lyra if the grain broth was supposed to be eaten hot or warm. Lyra said hot was preferred, but warm was acceptable. Dara said thank you and picked up the bowl. Lyra left. For a long time after the door closed, the room was quiet, except for the faint sound of Dara eating, and somewhere deeper in the ring, the very slow, very careful sound of an ancient civilization rethinking something it had always been certain about. The door to the Dragon Quarters was twice as tall as a normal door and 3 times as wide, and it opened without sound. That was the first thing Dara noticed, the silence of it. The whole section of the ring where the dragon delegation was housed had that quality, very still, very warm, lit by long panels of soft bioluminescent light that pulsed slowly, like breathing. It felt less like a space station corridor and more like the inside of something living. Elder Soren was already in the chamber when she arrived. He filled most of it. Dara had seen him at a distance in the ceremonial hall, but distance had flattened him into something her mind could manage. Up close, standing in a room with him, she understood properly for the first time what 4,000 years looked like on a body. His scales were the deep, layered color of cooled basalt, not gray exactly, but a color that contained gray the way deep water contains darkness. There were patterns in the scales, fine and intricate, that had not been put there by any external force. They had simply grown that way over centuries, the way stone develops lines under pressure and time. His eyes, when they turned to her, were gold with flecks of deep red, and they were very old. Not old like a tired thing. Old like something that had decided, a very long time ago, to keep paying attention. Dara walked in, stopped at what felt like a reasonable distance, and said good morning. Soren looked at her. He did not speak. She waited. She was not particularly uncomfortable with silence. Her work required a lot of focused quiet. She stood with her hands loosely at her sides and let him look. He studied her for a long time, not her face, all of her, the way she stood, the jacket she was wearing, the tool bag she had brought out of habit and then decided to bring anyway because leaving it behind felt strange. His attention was not threatening. It was more like being measured by something that took measurements seriously. Finally he spoke. His standard was perfect, with no translation unit, no processing delay. He simply spoke it, in a voice that was low and resonant and made the floor feel slightly more solid. In 4,000 years, he said, I have not once stood in a position I did not understand. He let that sit for a moment. I am standing in one now. Dara said, I'm sorry, I did not intend to cause a problem. You did not cause a problem, Soren said. You caused a question. Questions are more difficult. He tilted his great head slightly. Tell me who you are. So she told him. She said she was a calibration technician, 3rd grade, assigned to the EAC delegation for the duration of the summit. Before that she had worked atmospheric systems on a mid-orbital station above Earth's eastern coast. Before that, she had done her training on a small colony outpost where the air recyclers broke down twice a month and you learned fast how to fix them or you went home. She was from a city called Bransk, which was on the edge of a forest, and she had grown up wanting to study botany before she discovered that botany jobs were difficult to find on space stations and atmospheric calibration paid better. She still read botany manuals. She had one with her now in her bag. Soren listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he asked her the question she had been expecting since yesterday. What were you thinking when you offered the food to the hatchling? Dara thought about it carefully because she had been thinking about it carefully since yesterday and she wanted to give him an honest answer rather than a polished one. I thought it looked hungry, she said, and I thought, I don't know exactly, I thought maybe it was a little lost, Not lost like it didn't know where it was. Lost like it didn't know what it was supposed to be doing. Like everything in the room was arranged for it, and none of it was actually for it, if that makes sense. Soren was very still. "Say that again," he said. She said it again, more slowly. He closed his eyes. It was a large, slow movement, those enormous eyelids coming down and resting there. He stayed like that for almost a full minute. Dara waited. When he opened his eyes again, he said, "How do humans know when a creature is lost?" Dara considered this. "Mostly we guess," she said. "We look at how something is moving, what it's paying attention to, whether it's doing what it would normally do if it was comfortable. And I think," she paused, trying to be accurate, "I think we also remember what it felt like when we were lost ourselves. Humans have been unhappy in a lot of different ways for a very long time. We've had a lot of practice recognizing the shape of it." Soren was quiet again. His tail moved, one long, slow sweep. "You said the hatchling looked as though nothing in the room was actually for it." "Yes." "Describe what you saw." She thought about the ceremonial hall, the gifts lined up on the presentation table, the hatchling moving along them, sniffing each one, turning away, the room full of beings who were all watching the hatchling, and none of them, as far as she had seen, simply watching it the way you'd watch something to understand how it was doing rather than what it was going to do. "It kept looking at the table and then looking away," she said. "Not like the gifts were bad. More like they weren't what it was looking for, and it was getting tired of not finding it." She hesitated. Then she said the next part because it felt true and because she had come here to be honest. There was nobody in that room just being normal with it. Everyone was being very formal. I think that was exhausting. The silence that followed was longer this time. When Soren spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Do you know what a royal hatchling's life is like before it comes to a place like this?" Dara said she did not. He described it. Perfect safety, no sharp edges, no temperature variation, no unexpected sounds. Perfect nutrition, meals measured to the microgram, delivered at exact intervals, always the same because variation was considered a risk. Constant attendance. At no point in its life before this morning had the hatchling ever been more than 3 body lengths from a trained attendant. No uncertainty, no surprise, nothing spontaneous. Spontaneous kindness, Soren said, was specifically listed in the hatchling care protocol as a potential destabilizing variable. It had therefore been removed. Dara stared at him. "That sounds incredibly lonely," she said. Soren closed his eyes again. When he opened them, there was something in the gold and red depths that had not been there before, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of someone who has heard a simple thing said plainly and realized they have been thinking around it for a very long time. "Yes," he said, "we believe that is what the hatchling recognized in you, not the food, not your biology, not any compound or pheromone or signal." He paused. "Your willingness to notice." The room was quiet for a long time. Outside, somewhere in the ring's deeper corridors, the ventilation system cycled through a low hum. Dara listened to it without meaning to. "What happens now?" she asked. Soren regarded her steadily. "The Draconis Sovereign Collective will be making a formal request," he said. "Not to your ambassador, not to your political advisor, to you." He let the weight of that settle. "We are asking you to remain on the Concordat ring for an extended period, not as a diplomat, not as a representative of your species, as a companion to the hatchling." Dara looked at him. "It will be asking a great deal of you," he said. "I will not pretend otherwise." Dara looked down at her tool bag. She looked back up. She thought about the hatchling crossing that hall, past every dignitary, past every gift, past every being who had prepared something elaborate and expensive and arranged, to stop in front of a technician eating a forgotten protein bar. She said, "I'll need to keep doing my calibration work. The East Corridor sensor still has a fault." Soren made a sound that she realized, a moment later, was the draconic equivalent of a quiet laugh. "That can be arranged," he said. She nodded once, then yes, she said, "I'll stay." The hatchling started following Dara on her rounds on the 3rd day. Nobody had told it to. Nobody had suggested it. Vera had, in fact, actively discouraged it, positioning herself between Dara and the hatchling every morning when Dara came to collect her calibration bag. The hatchling simply walked around Vera, calmly, without rushing, as if Vera were a piece of furniture that had been placed inconveniently. The first day, Vera tried to redirect it 3 times. The second day, twice. On the third day, the hatchling walked past her, fell into step beside Dara, and Vera stood in the corridor with her tail very still and said nothing. Lyra, following at a respectful distance, wrote everything down. Dara's calibration route took about 2 hours if nothing was broken, and about 4 if something was. The Concordat ring's older sections had atmospheric systems that needed daily attention: humidity, oxygen ratio, trace particulate levels, temperature variance. Most of this work involved crouching in access panels, reading numbers off small screens, and making adjustments with a calibration tool that was no more exotic than a wrench. It was quiet, methodical work. The hatchling turned out to be very good at quiet and methodical. Dara talked to it while she worked. Not constantly, not in long speeches, the same way she would think aloud when she was alone. She said things like, "This one always reads low in the morning, I don't know why, and if I bypass this coupling the next section will overcompensate, so I have to do both." And once, when a panel cover slipped and nearly fell on her foot, something short and expressive that made Lyra's translation unit produce a string of uncertain symbols. The hatchling listened to all of it. It did not understand standard as far as anyone could tell. It listened anyway. On the 4th day, Dara reached the observation deck on the ring's outer rim at midday, her lunch break, and sat down on a bench with her food. The hatchling sat beside her. The deck had a wide, transparent panel looking out into deep space, and the stars were very clear and very still. They sat in that silence for a while. Dara ate. The hatchling watched the stars, and then watched Dara eat, and then watched the stars again. Dara pulled out a protein bar, chocolate-adjacent flavor, her actual first choice, and held out half of it. The hatchling took it with the same deliberate care it had used in the ceremonial hall. It chewed very slowly, as if giving the flavor serious consideration. "That one's better than the blueberry," Dara said. The hatchling looked at her. "In my opinion," Dara added. The hatchling looked back at the stars. It was during this lunch break that a Golsari diplomat, a senior envoy named Bress, who had been trying for 2 days to engineer a casual encounter with Dara, approached the observation deck. She stopped at the entrance and watched in silence while Dara explained to the hatchling, with genuine feeling, why the blueberry-adjacent protein bar was the worst flavor in the product line and why the manufacturer should have discontinued it 3 years ago. The hatchling, at one point, knocked the blueberry bar off the bench when Dara held it up as evidence. Dara sighed, gave the hatchling the chocolate one instead, and picked up the blueberry one from the floor. Bress filed a classified report that afternoon. It was 3 pages long and described, in careful diplomatic language, something she had not expected to feel while watching a human share snacks with a royal dragon hatchling on an observation deck, that she had witnessed an interaction so ordinary it had become, somehow, profound. She recommended that the Golsari Republic double its trade proposal to the EAC and stop trying to understand why. Back in the EAC delegation wing, Councillor Death had come to a different conclusion about the situation. He arrived at Dara's door on the 5th day with a prepared document. It was 3 pages of diplomatic language organized around a single purpose. Dara should begin using her time with the hatchling to steer conversations, introduce ideas, and gently create impressions favorable to the EAC's border negotiation goals. The document used phrases like organic influence and relational leverage and impression management in high-trust contexts. Death presented it with the tone of a man offering someone a great opportunity. Dara read it, she set it down, she said no. Death explained the opportunity she was passing up. Dara said she understood the opportunity, she still said no. Death said that her position as a delegate of the EAC came with certain obligations to represent EAC interests. Dara said her position was calibration technician, 3rd grade, and her obligation was to the atmospheric sensors. Death said that her continued clearance to remain on the ring was subject to EAC approval. Dara picked the document up again, folded it in half, and set it back down. "I'll tell the hatchling you said hello," she said. Death left. He looked like a man who was doing the mathematics of a situation and not enjoying the answer. That same afternoon, Rosen arrived on the ring. He was a senior EAC engineer, mid-40s, with grey at his temples and the specific patience of a man who had spent 20 years working with systems that broke in inconvenient places. He had been sent to provide technical support to the delegation's equipment. He took one look at the political landscape around Dara and volunteered to help her write the polite but final letters declining every diplomatic gift, trade consideration, and personal invitation that had been arriving in her message queue since day 2. They sat at a small desk for 2 hours while Rosen drafted and Dara approved. The Golsari Publishing House offer, no thank you. The Thurvak Envi's dinner invitation, appreciated, unable to attend. The 3 marriage proposals from alien dignitaries who had apparently decided she represented a desirable genetic or diplomatic acquisition, declined politely with no explanation. "You know this is only going to get worse," Rosen said, not unkindly. "I know," Dara said. "Death is going to find a way to apply real pressure." "I know that too." Rosen looked at her. "What are you going to do?" Dara thought about it. Then she drafted a short paragraph and showed it to Rosen. It said, simply, she would not carry messages, she would not advocate for any government, she would not use the hatchling's trust as a tool for any political purpose. If anyone attempted to make her do any of these things, she would inform the hatchling's attendants directly. Rosen read it twice. He said, "You're going to show that to Soren." "Yes." He thought for a moment. Add a line saying it applies to all civilizations, not just the EAC. Otherwise, it looks like you're only protecting against your own people. Dara added the line. She gave the document to Lyra that evening. The next morning, Elder Soren returned it to her with a single mark at the bottom, the draconic symbol that Lyra later told Dara meant, roughly, witnessed and recorded as binding. By the end of the second week, something strange was happening to the summit negotiations. Ambassador Hark noticed it first, then the other senior delegates began to notice it too. The Dragon delegation, Soren especially, was less rigid than in any prior session. Concessions were being offered that previous summits had spent years grinding toward. Positions that had been unmovable were being quietly revised. No one could point to a single moment where it had shifted. Hark asked Lyra privately what had changed. Lyra thought about her answer carefully. Then she said, "The young one is sleeping properly for the first time since hatching." She paused. "When a hatchling is well, the elders are less burdened. We did not know this was a variable. We had never had a hatchling that slept properly at a summit before." Another pause. "We had never brought one to a summit before." Hark stared at her. "So the negotiations are going well because a dragon is sleeping better." Lyra considered whether this was an accurate summary. "Because a human noticed it was unhappy," she said, "and did something ordinary about it. Yes." Hark went back to his quarters, sat down, and looked out at the stars for a long time. On the observation deck, Dara and the hatchling sat in their usual bench and looked at the same stars from a different angle. The hatchling had finished the chocolate-adjacent bar and was now, to Dara's mild concern, showing interest in her botany manual. "You can look," Dara said, tilting it toward the hatchling. "Try not to drool on it." The hatchling did not drool on it. It looked at the pictures of root systems with what appeared to be genuine interest, which was more than most people Dara had shown the manual to. They stayed there until the light panels in the deck shifted to evening tone. Then they went back inside, walking side by side down the corridor, and behind them, the stars continued their very old, very patient work of simply being there. The accusation arrived on a Tuesday. It came in the form of a formal diplomatic submission from the Thurvak Dominion, not their primary delegation, but their Office of Interspecies Verification, which was a branch of their government that existed specifically to challenge things other civilizations were doing that the Thurvak did not like. The submission was long and carefully worded. Its central claim was short, that Dara Voss, acting as an agent of the Earth-allied coalition, had been systematically feeding the royal hatchling of the Draconis Sovereign Collective a food item containing a mild psychochemical compound found in human-produced nutrition products, which had influenced the hatchling's behavior and perception in ways favorable to human diplomatic interests. In simpler terms, they were saying Dara had been drugging the dragon. The submission included a chemical analysis. It was a professional document. Someone had spent considerable time on it. Within 2 hours of the submission reaching the Concordat Ring's diplomatic records, the Dragon delegation went into lockdown. It was not a loud lockdown. There were no raised voices, no armored attendants, no dramatic sealing of doors. The Dragon quarters simply became very still and very closed, and the message came through official channels that the hatchling's contact arrangement with Dara Voss was suspended pending review. Vera sent a separate communication through Lyra, brief, formal, containing no editorializing, that said the senior attendant considered this development regrettable but appropriate given the seriousness of the allegation. Dara was in the East Corridor, fixing the sensor that had been misbehaving again when Rosen came to find her. He crouched beside her and explained what had happened in the same calm, clear way he explained engineering problems. He said the submission was from the Thurvac verification office. He said he had already started pulling everything he could on the chemistry claim. He said she should probably come with him. Dara finished the sensor adjustment first, then she went with him. The review panel was convened by noon. It was a joint session, representatives from every major delegation, 3 Concordat Ring arbiters, and Elder Soren sitting at one end of the table with his head slightly lowered, which Lyra later said was the draconic equivalent of someone holding very still because they did not trust themselves to move. Death was present. He sat slightly apart from the rest of the EAC table. He did not look at Dara. Ambassador Hark sat beside her and looked like he wanted to apologize for something but had not decided yet what. Rosen sat on Dara's other side. He had a data tablet. He had notes. The Thurvac verification representative, a precise, multi-limbed being named something that the translation unit rendered as Speaker Ven, presented the chemical analysis. It pointed to a compound found in trace amounts in standard human protein bar formulas, which it claimed had mild neurochemical effects on non-human neural architectures. It said the compound was present in every sample Dara had fed the hatchling. It said the effects of the compound on a young, developing draconic nervous system were unknown, but could not be ruled out as influential. The room was very quiet. Then the Concordat Ring's own chemical analysis came back. It had been ordered the moment the Thurvac submission was logged, because that was the Ring's procedure, independent verification, before any formal consideration. The results were read aloud by an arbiter. Oat flour, dried fruit paste, synthetic vanilla extract, iron supplement, stabilizer, flavoring compound blueberry adjacent, flavoring compound chocolate adjacent. No psychochemical compound, no neurochemical agent, no biologically active substance outside of normal nutrition. The Thurvac analysis had cited a compound that did not exist in the actual product. Either the analysis had been done on a different product entirely, or it had been fabricated. Speaker Ven said that the discrepancy would require further investigation. The Concordat arbiters said that until further investigation was complete, the original submission could not stand as the basis for ongoing review, which meant the review panel was over. The lockdown, however, remained in place while the Dragon delegation deliberated internally. That was their right, and no one challenged it. Dara went back to her room. Death came to see her that evening. He did not apologize. He said that the political situation had become complicated, and he wanted her to understand that the EAC had supported her throughout, and that he personally had never doubted her integrity. He said this with the confidence of a man who had spent several hours deciding that this was the version of events he was going to present. Dara looked at him for a moment. She said, I noticed you didn't sit with the delegation at the table. Death said the seating arrangement had been a matter of. Dara said she didn't actually need him to explain. She said good night, he left. Rosen knocked 20 minutes later and came in with 2 containers of hot food from the ring's human kitchen, beef-adjacent protein stew, which was not great but was warm. He sat down and they ate in companionable quiet. Dara asked if he had seen any update from the Dragon Quarters. He said no. She nodded. She said, I'm more worried about the hatchling than about any of this. Rosen looked at her. I know, he said. Inside the Dragon Quarters, in the chamber that had been arranged to the hatchling's preferences, warm, quiet, with a slow bioluminescent panel on the east wall, a scene was unfolding that no human witnessed. The hatchling had not eaten since morning. This was not obvious at first. Vera had arranged the standard feeding, correct portion, correct temperature, correct timing. The food was there. The hatchling was there. It simply was not eating. It sat facing the chamber's inner door with the calm, patient certainty of an animal that had decided it was waiting for something and would continue to wait. Vera watched, the attendants watched, the hatchling waited. Elder Soren came to the chamber at midday and watched too, for a long time, from the doorway. He watched the hatchling's eyes. They were not distressed. They were not scared. They were simply pointed at the door with the same focused, uncomplicated certainty that they had been pointed at Dara when the hatchling crossed the ceremonial hall. The hatchling was not protesting. It was not suffering dramatically. It was doing what it had been doing since the moment it hatched. It was being precise about what it needed. It needed the one being who had noticed it was a little lost. Vera said, and this was the most words she had directed at Soren in 30 years of working beside him, the arrangement was inappropriate from the beginning. This is a royal hatchling. It cannot form attachments to junior staff members from species with a lifespan of less than a century. The long-term implications. Soren said, what are the short-term implications of a hatchling that does not eat? Vera was quiet. Soren looked at the hatchling for a long time. Then he walked to the communications panel and sent a formal message to the EAC delegation's quarters, requesting the presence of Dara Voss in the Dragon Chambers. Immediately. Dara arrived still holding a container of cooling stew. She walked in with her jacket on and her tool bag over her shoulder because she had grabbed it by habit. She looked at the hatchling. The hatchling looked at her. Then it crossed the room and put its head against her arm. It did not eat the rest of the day's food. It stood beside Dara, with its head resting on her arm until the light panels shifted to evening tone. Then it went to its sleeping area, curled into its resting position, and slept. Vera stood on the other side of the chamber and said nothing. Her expression, which was not a face built for human-readable emotion, did something complicated. Lyra, watching from the corner where she had been cataloguing the day's events, wrote in her notes, the senior attendant appears to be grieving, not for the hatchling, for every hatchling before this one who was never given what this one has. The following morning, Elder Soren addressed the full review panel, which had reconvened to receive the Dragon delegation's decision on the lockdown status. He said the chemical analysis had been disproven and the accusation had no valid basis. He said the lockdown was lifted. Then he said something else. He spoke slowly and he chose every word carefully, and the translation units around the room had no difficulty with any of it because it was stated with perfect clarity. He said, for 4,000 years, the Draconis Sovereign Collective has kept its hatchlings safe. We have controlled every variable. We have removed every risk. We have been certain that safety was the highest thing we could give them. We were wrong. We gave them safety. We did not give them well-being. These are not the same. They have never been the same. A human technician with a protein bar and no political agenda understood this before we did. We will not forget it. And we will not pretend, in our own records, that it was a small thing. Speaker Venn from the Thurvac Verification Office had already filed a quiet withdrawal of the original submission. It did so without comment, which was, for the Thurvac, the equivalent of several paragraphs of apology. Death requested a transcript of Soren's statement. He received it. He read it twice. He was seen, later that afternoon, sitting alone in one of the ring's smaller common rooms, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man who had spent his entire career believing that all meaningful things in the galaxy were political in nature, and had just encountered evidence that he might have been missing something. The summit ended on a clear day, or what passed for a clear day on a space station, which meant the observation decks showed unobstructed stars, and the ventilation was running well, and nobody's atmospheric requirements were conflicting with anyone else's for the first time in 3 weeks. The final session produced more actual progress than any prior Concordat summit in 40 years. Veteran diplomats who had been attending these meetings for 2 decades said so openly, in the corridors, with the specific bewilderment of people who had been expecting the usual slow grind of position and counterposition, and instead found that several things they had planned to spend years negotiating had simply been resolved. The EAC received fair border terms. The Golsari republics received trade lane access they had been requesting for a decade. Even the Thurvak Dominion received something, a minor arbitration ruling that had been pending for 6 years, though there was a general, unspoken sense around the table that the Thurvak should be grateful for whatever they were given and not comment on it. Death told 3 separate journalists that the EAC's outcome was the result of careful, sustained diplomatic strategy. Ambassador Hark said nothing to the journalists. He said one thing to Rosen, quietly, at the closing reception. "We got that because a technician shared her lunch." Rosen said yes, and did not add anything, because there was nothing useful to add. The closing ceremony was formal and long and full of the traditional symbolic gestures that interspecies diplomacy required. Speeches were made, documents were signed. There were presentations of small cultural artifacts that would spend the next century in various government archives, being very carefully preserved and almost never looked at. Elder Soren made one addition to the closing ceremony that was not on the program. He spoke briefly, and what he said was this: the Draconis Sovereign Collective wished to formally acknowledge, in the Draconic record, a being who had been of service to a royal hatchling, not as an envoy, not as a representative of her species, as an individual. He used the old word seen, which Lyra translated into standard as best she could. To be seen was to have been genuinely perceived by a hatchling, and to have one's name entered into the lineage record as a result. It was the draconic equivalent of being written into a family history. Dara Voss's name was added to a record that stretched back 8,000 years. She was the first non-dragon in it. Dara sat in the 3rd row of the ceremony hall and heard this announced and felt, in sequence, surprise, a kind of warmth she could not name, and then embarrassment at being looked at by so many beings at once. She nodded at Soren. He inclined his great head in return. Vera, on Soren's left, had her eyes directed at a point on the wall behind and slightly above Dara's head. It was a very precisely chosen direction. Lyra, beside Vera, was writing in her catalogue with an expression of deep satisfaction. The hatchling attended the closing ceremony. It sat beside Dara and ignored all of it. Dara gave it half a protein bar. It ate with its usual careful attention to the flavors involved. Someone in the 3rd row of the other delegations was definitely recording this on a personal device that was definitely not supposed to be active during the ceremony. 3 separate governments would later request copies of the footage. 2 would get them. After the ceremony, the hatchling went back to its quarters with Vera. At the door it stopped, turned, and looked back at Dara for a long moment. Then it went in. That was the last time Dara saw it in person. She flew home a week later on the same standard EAC transport she had arrived on. She had a window seat. She spent most of the journey reading about the root systems of salt marsh plants, which were the current chapter in the botany manual. Back on Earth, things were strange for a while. Not bad strange, people were kind, mostly, but strange in the way that happens when an ordinary person has become a story that other people tell. There were interview requests. There were academic papers from 3 universities analyzing the draconic concept of the forbidden bite and what it implied about hatchling cognitive development. A cultural institute sent a formal inquiry asking Dara if she would be willing to donate the protein bar wrapper to their collection. She said she had thrown it away. They asked if she was certain. She said yes. Death's offers came in a group: 2 senior diplomatic postings, a speaking position at the EAC's Interspecies Relations Bureau, a scholarship in her name that she could administer, and a seat on an advisory panel for something called the Draconic Human Cultural Exchange Initiative, which Death had apparently founded and named in the week following the summit's conclusion. Dara declined all of it. Rosen helped her write the letters. They were polite and final. She took a posting at a mid-orbital atmospheric station above the coast she had grown up near. The sensors there were old and needed daily attention, and the work was exactly as unglamorous as it had always been. She had a small workspace with a desk and a tool rack and a shelf where she kept the botany manual and a small container of potting mix in which she was attempting to grow a kind of salt marsh grass in low gravity. It was not going well, but she was patient about it. The package arrived 14 months after the summit. It came via official draconic diplomatic courier, which was the most expensive delivery service in the known galaxy, reserved for objects of sovereign significance. The courier, a mid-sized automated transport with draconic insignia on its hull, docked at the station with more ceremony than the station had ever experienced before and probably ever would again. Inside the package was a single dragon scale. It was small, shed naturally, the way young scales shed as a growing hatchling replaces them, and it was iridescent, catching the light in shifting silver and gold green, the way the hatchling's full coat had done in the ceremonial hall 14 months ago. It was warm to the touch, though it had traveled through cold space, which was something Dara decided not to think about too carefully. There was no note, there was no official communication attached, there was no diplomatic language, no formal acknowledgement, no political framing. There did not need to be. Dara held the scale for a while. Then she carried it to her workspace and pinned it above her desk, beside the container of struggling salt marsh grass, where the light from the viewing panel caught it at a particular angle in the late afternoon and made the whole small space glow faintly silver. She went back to her calibration panel. The east sensor was reading low again, for reasons she had never fully resolved, and she had a theory about the coupling that she wanted to test before the end of the shift. Behind her, the scale caught the light and held it. Far across the galaxy, in a chamber that had been quietly modified, a window added, facing the direction of the Sol system, a particular panel set to run a soft gold-green bioluminescence in the late hours. A royal hatchling lay in its sleeping position and was, by every measure, its attendants had spent centuries learning to read, completely at peace. Vera sat watch at the chamber entrance the way she had sat watch at every entrance for 4,000 years. She watched the hatchling sleep. She thought about things she did not have the language to say out loud, because in 4,000 years of tending hatchlings, she had never needed language for what she was feeling now. Lyra passed by the entrance on her way to the archive room. She looked in. She saw Vera's face. She wrote one line in her catalogue and moved on. The line said, "She finally understands the difference." In the archive room, the records went back 8,000 years, long lists of names, events, decisions, and bonds. At the very end of the most recent hatchling's record, in fresh script, was a human name. The ink was the deep permanent kind. The kind used for things the collective intended to remember longer than most civilizations expected to last. Every dragon who read it knew what it meant. They were only now learning what to do with knowing it.